If you were standing beside the Detroit River at this very moment, you wouldn't simply be looking at infrastructure. You'd be staring at the visible edge of a major geopolitical confrontation unfolding in real time. On one side sits the Ambassador Bridge, old, overworked, and still carrying the crushing weight of a huge share of North American trade. A short distance away rises the Gordie Howe International Bridge, modern, polished, and built to represent the future of economic cooperation between the United States and Canada. It was supposed to open any moment. It was meant to symbolize progress. Instead, in only a matter of days, that optimism has collapsed into something far more dangerous. Because less than 3 days ago, Donald Trump set off a political and economic shock that caught Washington completely off guard. What made this move so stunning is that it did not follow his normal playbook. There were no new tariffs, no loud threats about trade deficits, no recycled slogans about unfair deals. This time, he aimed at a pressure point almost nobody expected. In the middle of the night, his administration signaled that the United States would simply decline to properly staff customs operations on the American side of the new bridge. No officers, no inspections, no processing, no flow of traffic. In one stroke, a project worth billions of dollars and years of diplomacy was turned from a symbol of partnership into an instrument of leverage. Before we get into how enormous the consequences of that decision could be, make sure you subscribe and drop your thoughts below, because this is not some routine political spat. This is a high-risk economic standoff, with consequences that could show up in your grocery bill, your fuel costs, and the price of the next car you buy. And the response from Canada's Mark Carney is shaping up to be something the White House very clearly did not expect. Trump's apparent calculation was not complicated. Put Canada under immediate pressure, create a sense of urgency, and force Ottawa to the table from a position of weakness. Reports indicate the demands tied to this pressure campaign were wide-ranging. Dismantle Canada's dairy protections, take a harder line against Chinese electric vehicles, and even entertain the idea of imposing major new fees on trucks crossing the border, a move that would wreak havoc on modern freight systems. It was the familiar formula: create chaos first, then present yourself as the only one who can resolve it. But this time, Canada did not panic. There were no emergency flights to Washington, no emotional outbursts, no dramatic displays designed for television. Instead, Mark Carney walked up to a podium in Ottawa and delivered a response so measured, so restrained, that many people missed the true meaning of it at first. He didn't even bother directly naming Trump. He didn't waste time arguing point by point over the trade demands. What he did say was that Canada would begin reviewing the operating conditions and strategic status of energy infrastructure corridors in the Great Lakes region. To the average viewer, that may have sounded like dry bureaucratic language. Just another government review, just more administrative noise, but to traders, to energy analysts, and to anyone who understands how tightly integrated North America's energy network really is, that statement landed like an explosion. In an instant, the conflict stopped being about a bridge. It became a confrontation over who actually holds the deeper power in the economic relationship. To understand why that matters, you have to appreciate how much value moves through that narrow corridor between Windsor and Detroit. Roughly a third of all trade between the United States and Canada passes through this gateway. That means billions of dollars in vehicles, machine parts, agricultural goods, industrial materials, and consumer products moving back and forth with almost unbelievable precision. But the real issue is not just volume, it is timing. Modern manufacturing, especially in the auto sector, runs on an unforgiving just-in-time system. Components do not sit around in warehouses for weeks anymore. They move exactly when they are needed. A single engine part, transmission component, or vehicle panel may cross the border multiple times before the final product ever rolls. Off an assembly line, delay that flow by a few hours, and entire plants in Michigan, Ohio, and Ontario can begin shutting down. So when Trump effectively threatens to freeze the operational value of the Gordie Howe Bridge, he is not only squeezing Canada, he is interfering directly with the bloodstream of American industry. And that is where the gamble starts to look a lot riskier than it may have first appeared. The assumption behind Trump's move seems to be that Canada needs the American market far more than the United States needs Canada. In that view, Ottawa is the dependent partner, and Washington can afford to play hardball. But Carney's response attacks that assumption at its foundation. Canada's strongest leverage is not just auto manufacturing. It is not dairy policy. It is not even border traffic. The real leverage sits in energy. The quiet but unmistakable focus of Carney's statement appears to be Line 5, the politically contentious pipeline that carries crude oil and natural gas, liquids from Western Canada through key parts of the American Midwest. This is not some minor piece of infrastructure. It feeds refineries, supports transport networks, and helps supply the fuel and propane millions of Americans rely on. In certain regions, it accounts for an enormous share of heating fuel and industrial energy needs. For years, activists and some local officials tried to shut Line 5 down, while Canada fought aggressively to keep it operating. Now suddenly, Ottawa seems willing to remind everyone what happens when that support becomes conditional. And the frightening part is that Canada would not even need to shut it off entirely to cause pain. A stricter review, slower approvals, adjustments to operating conditions, environmental scrutiny, regulatory friction, that alone could be enough to send markets into panic mode, because a bridge determines how quickly products move. But energy infrastructure determines whether factories run, trucks move, homes stay heated, and regional economies remain stable. If Line 5 were even partially constrained, the Midwest could face fuel disruptions, sharp price increases, and a broader industrial slowdown. That kind of pressure does not stay local for long. It becomes political almost immediately. The markets seem to recognize that imbalance faster than many politicians did. Instead of collapsing under the pressure, the Canadian dollar showed resilience. Meanwhile, U.S. energy markets reacted with visible anxiety. Traders were effectively signaling that Canada may hold the more dangerous form of leverage in this confrontation, and pay attention to who has not been making noise: the big American unions, the industrial lobby groups, the same constituencies that often support tough trade action. They have not exactly been rushing out to celebrate this strategy. Why? Because they know there is no clean win here. A seized-up border does not punish only Canadian exporters. It hits American factory workers, transport firms, suppliers, and entire communities tied to manufacturing. That is what makes this situation so combustible. Trump's political style depends on immediate force and visible pressure. The idea is simple: hit hard enough, create enough instability, and the other side folds. But that logic works best when both players are responding to the same kind of pressure. Mark Carney is not playing that game. He comes from a world of central banking, systemic risk, and financial crisis management. He is not interested in loud theatrics. He is looking at underlying dependencies, weak points buried beneath the surface, and pressure mechanisms that do not make headlines until the whole machine starts shaking. That difference matters enormously. Trump is focused on the bridge itself. Carney appears to be focused on the system behind the bridge. While one side is looking for a quick tactical win and a strong public narrative, the other is probing the hidden structural fragility of the North American economy. That is what makes Washington nervous. It is relatively easy to respond to a tariff. It is much harder to defend against a threat aimed at the invisible architecture of trade, fuel, and industrial continuity. For decades, the U.S.-Canada relationship operated on a quiet assumption of trust. The border, while busy, was considered stable, reliable, boring, even businesses built entire supply chains on the belief that these two countries would remain predictable partners no matter who occupied office. But once critical infrastructure becomes a bargaining chip, that assumption starts to die. Suddenly, policymakers and executives are forced to ask questions that would have seemed extreme not long ago. Can cross-border systems still be treated as dependable? Do companies need to redesign supply chains to reduce exposure? What does alliance even mean if one side can weaponize shared infrastructure overnight? And this is not some abstract policy seminar. Ordinary people will feel the results in tangible ways: more expensive groceries, higher heating bills, delayed car deliveries, rising prices at the pump, slower industrial output, less confidence in the market. The fallout appears in everyday life long before most people understand the mechanism behind it. So what happens next? One possibility is that pressure from corporate America begins building behind the scenes. Big firms with billions on the line may push both governments toward a quiet compromise. The bridge opens, public statements are issued, each leader claims victory, and the broader panic fades. But even if that happens, the relationship does not simply reset. The damage to trust remains. Once a vulnerability has been exposed, it cannot be unseen. The more dangerous possibility is escalation. If Trump refuses to step back and Canada decides to turn its energy review from a signal into a real instrument of pressure, the effects could be severe. Not just a trade dispute, not just a temporary bottleneck, something closer to a regional economic shock with the potential to spill outward into global markets. Because what we are really witnessing here is a live stress test of the globalization model itself. For years, companies across North America optimized everything around speed and cost. Inventory was cut, redundancy was removed, backup options were dismissed as inefficient. The system became incredibly fast, incredibly lean, and incredibly vulnerable, that works beautifully when everything is stable. But when a single crossing point becomes uncertain, or a major energy corridor becomes politically exposed, the weakness of that model is suddenly impossible to ignore. Extreme efficiency often comes at the price of extreme fragility and markets. Hate fragility when it is combined with unpredictability. That is the real poison here. Investors can price in bad news. They can even absorb conflict if the rules are clear. What they cannot tolerate is uncertainty inside one of the most important and historically stable trade relationships in the world. Trump has now injected exactly that uncertainty into the heart of North American commerce. Carney understands this better than most politicians ever could. His strategy is not based on shouting louder or reacting faster. It is based on allowing economic gravity to work in his favor. By signaling that energy corridors may no longer be untouchable, he is effectively encouraging American industries to put pressure on their own government. Automakers like Ford and General Motors do not have the luxury of waiting weeks for a political spectacle to resolve itself. They cannot redesign integrated continental supply chains overnight. When plants stop, cash disappears. When deliveries fail, investors panic. When energy costs jump, the entire cost structure shifts. That is the brilliance of Carney's move. He may not need to confront Trump directly at all. He may simply need to create enough fear in boardrooms that powerful American executives start demanding a resolution. Trump, meanwhile, is boxed in by his own image. His political identity depends on appearing stronger, tougher, and less willing to retreat than anyone else. If he backs away without extracting visible concessions, he risks looking like he overplayed his hand. But if he pushes forward and the result is an energy crunch or an industrial slowdown in the American Midwest, the people hit hardest could be the very voters and regions most central to his support. That is what makes this such a dangerous game. It is a collision between political theater and economic reality, and unlike a campaign rally or a social media fight, this one comes with consequences that cannot be spun away. What began as a late-night decision about customs staffing has grown into something much larger, a major test of how economic power is used between deeply intertwined allies. This is no longer just about whether a new bridge opens on schedule. It is about whether the United States and Canada can still treat their shared systems as neutral ground, or whether every link in that system is now fair game in a political confrontation. The next few days matter enormously. The outcome will shape more than the future of the Gordie Howe Bridge. It could alter how both countries think about security, trade, infrastructure, and dependence for years to come. And in a world where supply chains, markets, and energy systems are all tied together so tightly, the consequences of this standoff will not stop at the river. They will spread outward, across industries, across borders, and possibly across the global economy for a very long time.